The freight driver pulled his team to the shoulder when he saw the search party. 5 riders moving south along the bench road in the gray light before full dawn, breath smoking from horses and men alike. One rider carried a rolled blanket behind his saddle. Another carried a feed bag. These were not the supplies of a rescue. The freight driver had been on the frontier long enough to know what a blanket and a feed bag meant when carried toward a place where someone was supposed to be and was not. Then the lead rider stopped, and every man behind him stopped, and they all stared at something in the ravine below, something the freight driver could not see from the road, but that made one of them take off his hat in the freezing air, which was not a thing men did for the living. November of 1886 had already turned the bench road north of Cinnabar into a frozen track of wheel ruts and horse waste, when Beret Stensland hauled 2 sacks of flour, 5 pounds of coffee, a tin of lamp oil, and a repaired plowshare back toward the 160 acres that the law said could be hers if she lived on them long enough. Her husband, Odmund, had left in late summer. He had sold half their hay to cover gambling debt, taken a freight ride south, and not sent word since. The claim required 5 years of residence and improvement. Beret had completed 3. If she abandoned it now, every hour of split wood and turned soil died with the leaving, and Mulholland Grieve, who held Odmund's feed and freight notes, could pressure the land office and take what remained. She had $43 in outstanding debt to Grieve, 2 cords of cottonwood stacked against the cabin's north wall, 1 cracked stoveplate that leaked smoke into the 12 by 14-foot room she slept in, and 1 draft mare named Marta, gray, heavy, trained for freight, who was simultaneously her plow, her wagon engine, and the only living creature on the property besides herself. Selling the mare would erase the debt and leave Beret without the means to haul wood, water, or supplies from Cinnabar before the snow sealed the bench road for good. She needed 6 cords of fuel to pass the winter with herself and the horse alive. She had 2. The gap. 4 cords of wood she could not buy, could not borrow, and had no second pair of hands to cut, was the kind of arithmetic that killed women quietly on the Montana frontier, where a body found in spring earned a line in the Livingston paper and nothing else. No relatives waited in the East. No church fund would carry her. The cabin sat too far from steady timber to make daily cutting possible once the deep cold came. Every conventional solution, move into Cinnabar, board the horse, hire men to cut wood, required money Beret did not have and credit Grieve would not extend. She was, by every measure the territory understood, already finished. She simply had not stopped moving yet. The first person to tell her so directly was Orrin Bell. Bell was 56, a former Army teamster who had hauled ammunition wagons through Yellowstone country before the park existed, and now ran the stage yard at Cinnabar with a bad hip and a voice that carried across frozen ground like a hammer strike. He had crossed this weather for 20 years. He had pulled dead men off horses and live horses out of drifts. He did not dislike Beret Stensland. He disliked what he saw coming. He found her at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, having ridden the 3 miles from Cinnabar on a buckskin gelding that looked annoyed by the wind. Beret was splitting cottonwood rounds with a maul that weighed almost as much as her forearm. The sod lean-to behind the cabin leaked. Marta stood inside it with her head low, breathing clouds. Bell did not dismount. He sat the gelding and watched Beret swing the maul 3 times before he spoke. Mrs. Stensland. She set the maul head on the round and looked up. Flour dust still clung to her sleeve from the morning's haul. Her knuckles were raw from the cold. I count 2 cords against that wall, Bell said. Maybe 2 1/4 if you split tight. 2 1/4, Beret said. You need 6 to keep the stove running and the horse fed through March. You know that. I know that. Bell shifted in the saddle. The buckskin stamped. A lone woman cannot risk the bench road after the first hard clouds come over Sepulchre Mountain. You understand what I'm saying? Once the road closes, whatever you have stacked is what you have. No more hauling, no more cinnabar trips unless you want to die between here and there. Beret said nothing. She lifted the maul again. A horse finds a barn, Mrs. Stensland, Bell said. His voice was not cruel. It was tired. It does not find mercy. He turned the gelding and rode back toward the road without waiting for an answer. The wind picked up his tracks within the hour. Beret split 4 more rounds before the light failed. Her hand shook so badly by the last one that the maul glanced off the edge and buried itself in frozen dirt. She left it there and went inside to feed the stove with wood she could not afford to burn. That night she sat on the floor beside the cracked stove plate and counted what she had. 2 1/4 cords. $43 owed. 1 mare. 1 cabin with gaps in the chinking wide enough to pass a finger through. Coffee enough for 3 weeks if she drank it thin. Flour enough for 6 weeks if she ate nothing else. Lamp oil for perhaps a month. And a piece of paper she had not yet seen, the one Mahlon Grieve kept in his coat pocket, signed by Oddman Stensland before he left, giving Grieve conditional claim rights to the property if Beret defaulted on the debt before spring. She did not know about the paper yet, but it was already moving toward her. Grieve came 3 days later. He arrived in a freight wagon with his hired boy driving, as though the visit required witnesses. Grieve was 44, thicker through the chest than most men in the territory, with a feed merchant's hands, soft palms, strong grip. He owned the store credit that kept half the homesteaders between Cinnabar and Gardner alive through winter, and he collected on it with the patience of a man who understood that debt, given enough time, became land. Beret was patching the lean-to's south wall with mud and straw when the wagon pulled up. Marta shifted inside the stall, ears forward. The mare did not like Grieve. Beret had noticed this before, but had never given it language. Grieve stepped down from the wagon and stood in the yard with his coat open despite the cold, as though warmth were something he could afford to waste. Mrs. Stensland, I have business. I owe you $43, Beret said. I have not forgotten. $43, in the matter of the note. Grieve reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He spread it on the wagon's tailgate. Beret wiped her hands on her skirt and walked close enough to read it. The handwriting was Oddman's. She knew his letters, the way he pressed too hard on downstrokes. The note gave Grieve conditional rights to the claim if Beret failed to satisfy the feed and freight debt by the 1st of April, 1887. Oddman had signed it the week before he left. He had not told her. The cold that entered Beret's chest at that moment had nothing to do with weather. You understand what this means, Grieve said. I understand what Oddman signed. It means that if the debt is not cleared by spring, I have standing to petition the land office. The claim reverts. The improvements, such as they are, transfer. He looked at the cabin as though appraising kindling, including the horse. Beret's vision narrowed. She could feel the mud drying on her fingers, cracking in the cold. The hired boy on the wagon seat looked at his boots. I will pay the debt, Beret said. With what? Grieve folded the paper and returned it to his coat. You have no hay to sell. You have no husband's wages. You have a horse you cannot feed and a cabin you cannot heat. The merciful thing would be to sign over the mare now, clear the note, and take a room in Cinnabar until spring. I can arrange boarding. The mare is not for sale. She will be for sale when she starves, Mrs. Stensland, or when you do. Grieve climbed back onto the wagon. The hired boy flicked the reins. The wagon turned in the yard, cutting ruts into ground that Beret had spent 2 summers leveling. After they left, Beret stood in the yard for a long time. Marta put her head over the stall rail and breathed warm air against Beret's shoulder. The mare's ribs showed. The hay was already short. Beret pressed her forehead against Marta's neck and closed her eyes. She could smell horse sweat and sulfur, a faint yellowish tang that drifted from somewhere south, from the broken ravines and thermal cuts that laced the benchland between the claim and the river. She had smelled it before. Everyone had. It was Yellowstone country. The ground leaked. She did not think about it yet, not consciously, but the smell was there, lodged in the same part of her mind where her mother's voice still lived, saying things about stone and warmth that had seemed ordinary in Norway, and now, in Montana, seemed like something else entirely. The idea did not arrive as an idea. It arrived as a horse refusing to eat. 4 days after Greaves' visit, Beret hauled a half bale of poor hay into the lean-to and set it in the manger. Marta sniffed it, turned her head south, and would not eat. The mare stood with her nostrils wide, pulling at air that came from somewhere beyond the ridge. Beret had seen animals refuse feed before. Colic, bad water, worms. But Marta was not sick. She was interested. Her ears pointed south like compass needles toward the ravine where the snow thinned and the sage grew in odd patterns and the air tasted of sulfur and wet rock. That evening, Beret walked to the edge of the cut behind her claim. The ground sloped into a shallow ravine, maybe 40 feet deep, choked with dead sage and willow scrub. At the bottom, where the snow should have been deepest, it was thinnest. In one spot, maybe 6 feet across, the snow was gone entirely. Bare dark stone sat exposed, ringed by yellow-white mineral stain. A faint shimmer of vapor rose from a crack no wider than 2 fingers. Beret crouched and held her hand above the stone. Warm. Not hot enough to hurt, but warm enough that the air above it moved differently than the frozen air surrounding it. She stayed there for 10 minutes, watching the vapor curl upward, watching how the snow at the edges softened and sagged. The ground was breathing. It had been breathing long before she arrived, long before any cabin or claim or debt existed. The earth was losing heat, and the heat was finding its way to the surface through cracks that no one had thought to use because the territory's wisdom about thermal ground was simple: stay off it or die in it. That night in the cabin, with the stove burning wood she could not replace, Beret remembered her mother, not the memory of a lesson, the memory of a gesture. In the cellar of the farmhouse, outside Bergen, where root vegetables were stored through the Norwegian winter, her mother had pressed her palm flat against the cellar wall and held it there. Young Beret had asked why. "Feel," her mother had said. "The stone holds what the air has already lost. Warmth hides in rock before it shows in weather." Her mother had been talking about root storage, about keeping turnips from freezing by packing them against the wall, where the earth's own temperature, not warm, but warmer than the killing air above, kept frost at bay. It was a farmer's knowledge, passed through women who never wrote it down, carried in the specific pressure of a hand against damp stone. Beret sat in the cabin and pressed her own hand against the log wall. Cold. The wall radiated nothing. Every degree of heat the stove produced, the cabin gave back to the Montana night through gaps in thin wood and a cracked iron plate. But the ravine did not give heat back. The ravine produced it, endlessly, without fuel, without labor, without any resource Beret had to buy or cut or carry. The question was not whether the heat existed. The question was whether a person could survive inside it without being scalded, poisoned, or soaked to death. Beret tested the idea the way her mother would have, with scraps before certainty. She cut 2 strips of wool from a worn blanket. The first she hung on a sage branch in the open air, 50 yards from the ravine, The second she hung on a stick pushed into the ground 3 feet from the warm seep. By morning, the open-air strip was frozen rigid. She could have snapped it like bark. The strip near the seep was damp and warm. It bent in her hand. It had not frozen. She pushed a cottonwood stick into the yellow-stained snow at the vent's edge. When she pulled it out 20 minutes later, the bark was dark with moisture and the wood was warm to the touch. Vapor had saturated it. She knelt and held her face near the crack where steam escaped. The air was humid and carried a faint egg rot smell. Hydrogen sulfide, though Beret had no name for it. She knew only that it made her eyes sting if she stayed too close and too low. She pulled back and breathed clean air and noticed that the sting faded quickly if she kept her head above the level of the crack. The steam rose. The bad air settled. This was important. This was the difference between a shelter and a grave. Over the next 3 days, Beret mapped the ravine's thermal features the way a carpenter maps a foundation, by touch, by observation, by putting her body where the information was. She found 2 active seeps. The larger one, at the ravine's deepest point, breathed steady vapor from a crack in dark basalt. The smaller one, 20 yards upslope, was weaker, barely warm, more of a damp exhalation than a steam vent. The ground between them was ordinary frozen dirt and stone. She began to see the shape of something. Not a house, not a cabin. An emergency pocket. A space where a person caught between cinnabar and the claim in a sudden storm could survive the night without fire, without walls, without anything except the material she could carry under a wagon seat and the heat the earth was already producing. The design took form through problems, not inspiration. She needed a frame to hold canvas above the vent without collapsing into it. Willow rods, bent and lashed. She needed a cover that would trap warm air while shedding snow. The heavy wagon tarp waxed and grommeted. She needed to keep the vent's gases from pooling at ground level. A trench dug downwind to draw cold air in low, a slit cut high to let steam and gas escape upward. The radius 10 feet of cleared snow. The frame, 6 to 8 willow ribs bent into a low dome. The base, deadfall poles cut short and set as crutches to keep the canvas above the vent mouth, never directly on it. Snow blocks banked around the edges to anchor the tarp and cut the wind. And always, always, the high slit and the low trench. Close those, and the shelter became a room full of invisible death. Beret understood this. She understood it not as chemistry. She had no formal schooling past 13, but as the same principle that kept her mother's cellar from filling with the heavy, stale air that collected in the lowest corners. Bad air sinks, good air rises. Make a door for each, and the earth's warmth becomes something you can borrow instead of something that kills. But understanding a principle and trusting her life to it in a blizzard were 2 different things, and Beret was not yet sure which kind of knowing she needed. She found out from Celia Dorr, who arrived uninvited on a Thursday morning with a sack of old flour and a question she did not bother to soften. "I heard you are sleeping in the devil's wash basin," Celia said. "I am not sleeping anywhere near it," Beret said. "I am testing it." Celia was 38, a neighbor's wife, mother of 4, and the kind of woman who measured danger by counting the children it could leave motherless. She was not unkind. She was afraid, and fear in Celia looked like logic. "Wet warmth kills faster than dry cold once you step out of it," Celia said. She stood in Beret's yard with her arms crossed and her breath smoking. "You heat yourself with steam, then walk into a freeze, and the wet pulls the life out through your skin. Any trapper will tell you that." "I know that," Beret said. "Then what are you doing?" Beret led Celia to the cabin and showed her the 2 wool strips, still hanging where she had placed them, the frozen one and the warm one. Celia touched both. She said nothing for a moment. "A rag is not a woman," Celia said finally, "and one night is not a winter." "I am not trying to replace winter," Beret said. "I am trying to survive one night when the road closes and the stove cannot save me. One night. That is all." Celia looked at her with the expression of a woman who has done the same arithmetic and arrived at a different answer. She picked up the warm strip, squeezed it, watched water run from the wool. "Wet," she said. "Everything in that ravine is wet. Wet canvas, wet clothes, wet horse. What happens when you come out?" It was a strong objection. Beret did not have a complete answer. She had a partial one. Dry clothes sealed in oilskin, kept outside the dome until the person was ready to leave. But partial answers did not satisfy Celia Dorr, and Beret respected that because partial answers should not satisfy anyone whose children lived 3 miles from a thermal vent. Celia left without promising to return. She did not forbid Beret to continue. She simply said, "Be careful who watches you fail," and walked back toward the road with the sack of old flour still sitting on Beret's table. That flour, unsolicited and unacknowledged, would last Beret 12 days. The community heard what communities always hear, the version that makes the best story at someone else's expense. By the second week of November, the men at the Cinnabar store had a name for the ravine, the Devil's Wash Basin. A freighter named Potts claimed Beret was digging a grave for the mayor. 2 women told Celia that letting children anywhere near Beret's claim was inviting the kind of accident that made coroners write willful neglect on certificates. A stage driver said Beret would boil the hide off the horse before Christmas. None of them had seen the ravine. None of them had touched the warm stone or watched the vapor curl. They knew only what Grieve told them, which was the version that served Grieve, a woman unhinged by abandonment, taking counsel from a horse, playing with yellow snow and calling it salvation. Grieve's attack was never loud. He was a merchant, and merchants understood that debt was more useful than anger. He refused Beret further credit unless she signed a conditional sale of Marta. He told the store crowd, with the same weary patience Bell had used, that madness in winter was a problem for the whole settlement, because search parties cost men and horses that could not be spared. "A woman who takes counsel from a horse," Grieve said, leaning on the counter with Odman's note somewhere in his coat, "has already lost the claim." The words circled back to Beret within 2 days, carried by a freight driver who repeated them as a kindness, the way people deliver insults they believe the recipient should hear for their own good. Beret did not argue. She could not afford to argue because argument required standing still, and standing still in November with 2 cords of wood and a starving mare was a luxury identical to death. She went to the store on a Monday, placed $3 silver on the counter, money she had saved from summer egg sales, hidden in a tobacco tin Odman never searched, and bought nails, lamp wicking, and canvas grommets. Grieve leaned forward. "You need cordwood, Mrs. Stensland, not grommets." "I need time," Beret said. She gathered her purchases and left. The hired boy at the door stepped aside without being asked. Something in the way Beret moved through the room, not angry, not defiant, just relentlessly forward, made people give her space even as they doubted every step she took. Outside, Marta waited at the rail. Beret loaded the supplies into the wagon bed, next to the rolled tarp she had already begun mending with waxed thread. The mare turned her head south again, toward the smell only she and Beret seemed to follow. Grieve watched from the store window. He now knew 2 things. Beret was preparing something near the ravine, and she had money he had not accounted for. The first made her foolish. The second made her dangerous. What Beret lost in the store she could not measure in dollars. Credit was survival on the Montana frontier. It was flour on account, hay delivered against spring payment, stove parts held until wages came. Without credit, every purchase required cash she did not have. Without neighborly sympathy, every emergency became hers alone. Celia still nodded when they passed on the road, but the nod was shorter now, and Celia's husband no longer waved from the fence. Isolation accumulated like snowfall, slow, quiet, and lethal if it lasted long enough. But Beret had the grommets, she had the nails, she had the wicking for the lantern, and $3 silver worth of proof that she was not waiting for rescue. She began cutting willow. The willow grew thick in the creek bottom east of the cabin, where summer runoff fed roots deep enough to survive the freeze. Beret needed 40 rods, each 6 to 8 feet long, straight enough to bend without snapping, and green enough to hold a curve when lashed. She cut them with a hand saw that had belonged to Oddmund, and that Oddmund had never sharpened properly. Each rod took 4 minutes. Her shoulders burned by the 10th. By the 20th, she could not raise her arms above her head without the muscles in her back seizing. She cut 20 rods the first day. She stacked them beside the lean-to and covered them with the old flour sacks Celia had left. That night, she mended the wagon tarp by lantern light. The heavy canvas, 12 feet by 14, had 2 rotten seams where rain and sun had eaten the thread. She re-sewed them with waxed linen, pulling each stitch tight enough to hold against wind. Along the edges, she punched holes and set the grommets she had bought from Grieve, 12 brass rings that would accept iron stakes or rawhide loops. Each grommet took 10 minutes to set properly. Her cut fingers bled through the first 3. By the end of the second day, she had 20 rods cut and 6 grommets set. She needed 40 rods and 12 grommets. She needed 4 short deadfall poles to serve as crutches inside the dome. She needed rawhide loops to tie the tarp to Marta's harness in case she had to anchor it against wind with the mare's body. Progress was measurable and insufficient. She could track what she had done and see clearly how much remained, and the gap between the two was the shape of her fear. The weather helped briefly. 3 days of stillness that let her cut another 12 rods and set 4 more grommets. Then a wet wind came through the pass and dropped 6 inches of snow that turned the creek bottom into a mud chute. She lost a day digging the wagon out. She lost another half day when the saw blade caught on a knot and the handle cracked. She repaired it with rawhide and rage. Marta lost weight. The hay was down to what Beret estimated at 6 weeks' worth if she cut the ration by a third. Cutting the ration meant a weaker horse, and a weaker horse meant slower hauling, and slower hauling meant fewer trips to Cinnabar before the road closed. The arithmetic never improved. It only rearranged itself into different shapes of not enough. And then a man she had never seen before rode into the ravine while she was testing the vent, and the arithmetic changed. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? He was on foot, not horseback, a mistake she corrected in her memory later. He came down the south slope of the ravine, carrying a stonemason's tool bag and a canvas satchel that clinked with hardware. He was 62 years old, though Beret would not learn that for another week. His name was Tolef Assen. He was Norwegian-born, same as Beret's parents. He had been a stonemason, then a bathhouse carpenter, then an occasional repairman near the Mammoth Springs, where the Park Service kept him busy enough to eat and not busy enough to save. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, the ring finger and the small one, lost when a Springbox's mineral crust broke under his weight and the boiling water did what boiling water does. He came into the ravine because he was taking a shortcut between the Gardner Road and a repair job at a hay camp, and the thermal cuts were the fastest route when you knew where to step. He had been walking thermal ground for 12 years. He knew where to step. He stopped when he saw Beret crouch near the vent with a wet cloth strip held on a stick, testing the temperature of the steam at different heights. Most men would have shouted at her to move. Tolef stood still and watched. He watched for almost a full minute, long enough to see that she was not standing on the yellow crust, that she was testing from the side, that she had placed her feet on exposed stone and sage roots, not on the mineral ground that could break and drop a leg into water hot enough to strip flesh. She was doing it right, not perfectly. Her position was too close, and the stick was too short. But the instinct was correct. She was measuring before trusting. Tolef walked down to within speaking distance and set his tool bag on a stone. "You are testing the vent," he said in English that still carried Bergen vowels even after decades. Beret stood up fast. She held the stick like a weapon for half a second before she recognized that the man was old, calm, and had positioned himself on safe ground without being told. "I'm seeing how hot it is," she said. "It is not the heat that matters at this distance," Tolef said. "It is what the heat carries. Put your cloth lower, near the ground, then pull it away and smell it." Beret lowered the cloth to 6 inches above the dirt. She held it for 10 seconds, then pulled it to her face. The egg rot smell hit her eyes before it reached her nose. She blinked and stepped back. "Sulfur," Tolef said. "Heavy. It pools in low places. If you build something here and sleep with your face near the ground, you will not wake up." "I know that," Beret said, though she had not known it precisely enough until that moment, and both of them understood the difference. Tolef looked at the willow rods stacked near the ravine's edge. He looked at the canvas tarp folded beside them. He looked at the iron stakes and the rawhide loops and the hatchet Beret had been using to clear snow from around the vent. "You're building a dome," he said. "I'm building something that might keep me alive if I get caught between here and Cinnabar in a storm." Tolef picked up one of the willow rods and bent it between his 7 remaining fingers. It flexed cleanly. He set it down. "Come here," he said. He walked to the edge of the vent and pointed at the ground without stepping on it. "You see the white line? That is mineral crust. It forms over water. Sometimes the water is 2 inches below. Sometimes it is 2 feet. Never trust it. Step on sage roots or exposed stone. Never on yellow-gray ground." He was not offering charity. He was not rescuing a helpless woman. He was responding to competence, imperfect, dangerous, real competence, with the specific knowledge that could keep it from becoming a death. Beret listened. She did not argue. She did not thank him. She asked, "What else?" Tolef sat on a stone and told her. "Build beside the vent mouth, not on top of it. Let steam enter sideways under a baffle made of poles. Cut the low trench to face downwind so that heavy gas drains out instead of pooling inside. Cut the high slit so that steam and warm air vent upward. If a candle flame gutters near the ground while the upper air stays clear, leave immediately." "And the horse," he said, because he had seen the harness marks on the ground where Marta had stood. "Keep the horse's head toward the upper opening. A horse breathes low. If the bad air collects, the horse dies first, and then you have no horse and no warning." Beret nodded. She could feel the shape of the design changing in her mind, not the purpose, but the geometry. Tolef was not giving her a different idea. He was giving her the corrections that separated a plausible theory from a survivable structure. "How do you know this?" she asked. Tolef held up his left hand. The 2 missing fingers were answer enough. But he added, "I built a spring box at Mammoth without checking the crust. I stood where I should not have stood. The ground dropped. The water came. I was lucky enough to lose only fingers. He paused. And once, a long time ago in Norway, a widow showed me how to stack stone against a cellar wall so the warmth stayed in the earth instead of rising and wasting. I thought it was a woman's trick. She thought I was a fool. We were both partly right. He picked up his tool bag and slung it over his shoulder. I will be at the hay camp for 3 days. If you have the dome standing when I come back, I will tell you what is wrong with it. He walked out of the ravine the way he had entered, on safe stone, on sage roots, on ground that held. Beret watched until he crested the slope and disappeared over the south ridge. She turned back to the vent. The vapor curled upward in the cold air, steady and indifferent. She had 32 willow rods cut. She needed 8 more. She had 10 grommets set. She needed 2 more. She had a design that was incomplete and a teacher who might return in 3 days or might not. The snow began again that evening. Not hard, not yet. Just enough to remind her that the earth measured time differently than she did, and that the distance between preparation and disaster was narrowing with every hour she was not working. She picked up the saw. She walked to the creek bottom. She cut willow until the light failed, and then cut 2 more rods by feel, her fingers finding the straight grain in the dark the way her mother's fingers had found the warm stone in a cellar that was 5,000 miles and a lifetime away. 34 rods, 8 grommets still to finish, a dome that existed only in theory, a mentor who might not return, and a storm building somewhere north of the Yellowstone that would not wait for any of it. Tolif Asen came back in 4 days, not 3. He did not explain the extra day. He walked into the ravine carrying his tool bag and a coil of rope that had not been there before, and he found Beret standing inside a sagging, lopsided willow dome that looked like something a drunk had built to insult architecture. She had used all 40 rods. She had set the last 2 grommets by lantern light the night before, punching through canvas with a nail and a stone because the grommet tool had slipped and gouged her thumb. The tarp was draped over the frame, staked at 6 points, and anchored on the windward side with a deadfall log. The 4 crutch poles stood inside, holding the canvas above the vent mouth. Steam leaked from the high slit she had cut near the top. The low trench was dug on the north side, facing what she judged to be the prevailing wind. Tolif walked around the dome without speaking. He pressed the canvas at 3 points. He crouched and looked at the trench. He lifted the edge of the tarp and looked at the crutch poles. Then he straightened up and said, "The trench is too narrow. The canvas pitch is too flat, and you have 1 crutch sitting on mineral crust." Beret looked at the pole he meant. It was the farthest one from the entrance, planted on a patch of ground that looked like ordinary dirt, but had the faint yellow-gray tint she was learning to read. "Move it," Tolif said. "Now, before your weight shifts the load and it punches through." She moved it. The ground where the pole had sat crumbled slightly when she pulled the base free. Underneath was wet, warm earth that smelled of sulfur and rot, 2 inches of crust over heat. She had been standing 3 feet from a hole that could have dropped her ankle into scalding mud. Tolif did not lecture her about it. He picked up a willow rod and used it to probe the ground in a circle around the vent, tapping the way a blind man taps a path. Where the rod met solid stone, the sound was flat. Where it met crust, the sound was hollow, a faint, sick echo that Beret would never forget once she heard it. "Sound first," Tolif said, "then step." Over the next 6 days, Tolif came to the ravine every morning after his repair work and stayed until the light began to fail. He did not move into Beret's cabin. He did not eat her food. He brought his own, hardtack, dried meat, coffee that tasted like bark, and he sat on the same stone each morning and watched Beret work before he said anything, He taught the way stonemasons teach, through correction, not theory. When Beret set a willow rib too upright, he bent it flatter and showed her how water runs down a steep curve instead of dripping from a shallow one. When she tied the rawhide loops too tight, he loosened them and explained that canvas expands when it absorbs steam, and a tight tie will rip free while a loose one flexes. When she dug the cold air trench with a flat bottom, he shaped it into a channel that sloped downward away from the dome so heavy gas flowed out instead of pooling. Each lesson was specific. Each lesson was tied to something that had gone wrong before. Not for Beret, but for Tolef, or for the people he had watched make mistakes on thermal ground over 12 years of living near Mammoth. He told her about a man named Eckert, who had built a warming shed over a hot spring and sealed it tight against the wind. Eckert fell asleep and did not wake. The gas had no exit, so it filled the floor and then the room. They found him in the morning with his face on the ground and his color wrong. He told her about a horse that broke through crust near a trail and stood screaming in water to its belly while 3 men tried to pull it free with ropes. The horse lived. Its legs did not. He did not tell these stories to frighten Beret. He told them to anchor each rule in a consequence. Never seal the slit. Never sleep low. Never trust crust. Never let the horse stand where you have not tapped first. Each rule had a body behind it, or nearly. Beret listened the way she had listened to her mother, with her hands busy and her mind open. She rebuilt the dome twice under Tolef's direction. The second version was lower, tighter, steeper in its canvas pitch. The crutch poles stood on stones Tolef had tested by striking each one with his mason's hammer. The trench was wider and sloped at an angle that let cold air flow in near the ground, while warm air rose and exited through the slit. The third version, the one that held, looked less like a shelter and more like a wound in the snow. Low, ugly, wrapped in stained canvas with rawhide knots at every stake point. Vapor leaked from the top slit in a thin, steady line. The inside was humid, loud with the hiss of steam against canvas, and warmer than any space Beret had entered since September. She and Tolef stood inside it together on the 8th day. The air was thick. Condensation ran down the steep canvas walls in lines that collected in the drip channel Tolef had shown her how to dig. A groove around the interior edge that kept water from pooling on the floor. The vent steam entered sideways under the pole baffle, hit the canvas, rose, and exited through the slit. The heavy gas, the sulfur, the invisible weight drained through the trench. Tolef lit a candle stub and held it at knee height. The flame burned steady. He lowered it to ankle height. The flame bent, flickered, and leaned hard toward the trench. "See," he said, "the bad air's leaving. When it stops leaving, when the flame dies, you leave." Beret nodded. She could feel sweat on her neck for the first time in weeks. The warmth was strange, not the warmth of a stove or fire. Wet, mineral, alive in a way that made the air feel like breath from something enormous sleeping under the ground. "Will it hold in wind?" she asked. "Nothing holds in real wind," Tolef said, "but if you stake deep and bank snow at the base, it will hold long enough. Long enough is what matters." Orrin Bell found them at the ravine 2 days later. Bell had not come looking for Beret. He had come to check a stage road marker that had tilted in a freeze and happened to see smoke, or what looked like smoke, rising from the cut where everyone knew Beret Stensland was pursuing her madness. He rode the buckskin down the slope and found Tolef and Beret dismantling the practice dome and rolling the canvas. Bell dismounted this time. He walked to the vent, saw the mineral stain, saw the cleared ground and the stake holes and the trench, and stood for a while with his hands in his coat pockets. "You built a tent over a steam hole," he said. "A dome," Beret said. With ventilation. Mrs. Stenslen, I have pulled frozen men out of places they thought were warm enough. A steam vent is not a barn. It is not a stove. It is a crack in the earth that does whatever it wants, and what it wants changes without asking. Tulef set down the rolled canvas and looked at Belle. They knew each other, not well, but in the way that men who have both survived Yellowstone winters recognize each other's authority. She is not building a barn, Tulef said. She is building a last breath. Belle stared at him. A last breath. When the road closes and the stove fails and the horse cannot find the trail, one night, maybe two, the difference between a body in a drift and a woman who walks into Cinnabar the next morning. Belle looked at the dome site. He looked at Beret, whose hands were raw and whose face had thinned since he had last seen her. He looked at Tolef's missing fingers. And if the gas shifts, Belle said, if the vent surges, if the crust breaks, then it is not a last breath. It is a last mistake. Every breath on this ground is a mistake by your measure, Tolef said. The question is whether the alternative is worse. Belle did not answer. He mounted the buckskin and left the way he had come, and Beret watched him go with the knowledge that his doubt was not foolish, and that answering it required something more than words. The setbacks did not come in sequence. They came in clusters, the way trouble does when a person is already stretched past their margins. On the third day of the second week, wind tore a seam in the tarp that Beret had mended twice already. The wax thread held, but the canvas around it frayed, and she had to cut a patch from the edge, losing 2 grommets, and sew it over the weak point with thread she could not replace. On the 5th day, Greaves' hired boy, a sullen 14-year-old named Darrow, who followed instructions the way dogs follow kicks, came to the ravine while Beret was at the cabin and moved her willow bundle. He dragged it 30 feet downslope and left it in a snowmelt channel where the rods soaked through. Beret found them that evening warped and heavy. She saved 6. She needed to cut replacements for the rest, and the creek bottom was now covered in enough snow that reaching straight willow required an hour's digging before each rod. On the 7th day, a small vent she had not mapped, a secondary seep 6 feet from the main one, spat a gout of boiling mud that hit the side of her right boot and ate through the leather before she could kick it off. The burn was not deep, but it blistered the skin above her ankle and made walking on uneven ground a sharp negotiation with pain for the next 4 days. Each setback cost time she did not have. November was more than half gone. The sky had the color of old iron. Snow fell every second or third day, not heavily, but with the patient insistence of a season that was still warming up. Beret's supplies dwindled in a straight line. Coffee gone by the end of the 3rd week. Flour stretched with water into a paste she ate cold because cooking fuel could not be spared. She drank hot water from a tin she held above the vent, carefully, testing first, and told herself it was soup. Marta's ribs showed clearly now. The mare ate her reduced ration and stood in the lean-to with her head turned south, always south, as though the ravine were a stable she had been promised. And then, on a morning when the pain in her ankle had finally dulled to an ache, Celia Dorr arrived carrying a bundle of old flour sacks and set them on the ground beside the lean-to without ceremony. For the seams, Celia said, not for the madness. She left before Beret could answer. The flour sacks were clean, heavy cotton, perfect for reinforcing the patches on the tarp where Beret had run out of canvas. Celia had cut them into strips before she came, which meant she had spent time at her own table preparing them, which meant she had not stopped thinking about what Beret was doing, even if she could not bring herself to say it was right. Beret sewed the strips into the tarp that evening. Her hands ached, her ankle throbbed. The lantern burned oil she would not be able to replace. Outside, Marta shifted in the lean-to, and the wind carried sulfur, and the temperature dropped another degree toward the number that would make everything Beret had built either a salvation or a joke. The shelter, when complete, did not look like salvation. It looked like a bundle. Rolled canvas, 12 willow ribs lashed in pairs, 6 iron stakes, 2 rawhide hobbles, a hatchet, a coil of rope, a stub of candle in a tin, and a square of oilskin wrapped around a dry shirt and dry stockings. The entire kit fit beneath the wagon seat, lashed to the undercarriage with the same rawhide loops that would anchor the dome in wind. Beret practiced twice in mild cold. The first practice took 35 minutes from unrolling the canvas to sitting inside with the slit open and the trench dug. Too slow. In a real storm, with frozen hands and a panicked horse, 35 minutes was the difference between building a shelter and building a coffin. The second practice took 22 minutes. She had memorized the order. Clear snow with the hatchet handle, stamp a circle, plant the ribs in pairs at opposite points, tie the crown lashing, drape the canvas, stake the edges, set the crutch poles inside on tested stone, cut the trench with 4 hatchet blows, and open the slit by pulling the drawstring she had sewn into the top seam. 22 minutes. In calm air, with light, without wind, without a 1,600-pound draft horse trying to bolt. But the numbers inside the dome were encouraging. In 20 minutes, frost softened on the canvas interior. In 40 minutes, the air was warm enough that breath stopped clouding. Water in a tin cup steamed but did not boil. The inside of the tarp sweated. Snow at the base slumped inward, melting from below. The candle flame held steady at waist height and flickered only near the ground, confirming that the trench was working. Bell heard about the practice runs. He said nothing to Beret, but he told a stage driver that practice in calm air meant nothing in a whiteout, and the driver told Beret, and the information traveled the way all information traveled in that country, slowly, with damage at each retelling. Celia said Marta would panic inside canvas. She had not seen the dome, but she knew horses, and horses hated enclosure. Greaves said Beret was wasting the last weeks she should have spent cutting wood. He said it loudly enough that 3 men in the store heard it, and one of them repeated it to Bell, who filed it as evidence that Greaves was less interested in Beret's survival than in Beret's failure. None of their objections were foolish. Every one of them named a real risk. Beret could not argue with the risks. She could only prepare for them and hope that preparation was enough when the earth decided to test it. The weather turned the way weather turns in Yellowstone country, not gradually, but with the contempt of something that has been patient long enough. The sky went brass before noon on a Tuesday. The light flattened, shadows disappeared. The wind died completely, which was worse than wind because stillness in late November on the Yellowstone Plateau meant the air was holding its breath before hitting. Telegraph talk in Cinnabar said cold was moving south from the Northern Territories. A freighter who had come down from the Judith country said the cattle up there were already drifting against fences, and the ranchers who had not sold in October were praying men by November. The winter of 1886 to 87 would kill cattle in numbers that made the territory reassess everything it believed about open-range grazing. But in late November, the dying had not yet begun in full. It was still just weather. It was still just cold. Tolliff came to the ravine one last time before leaving for a repair job at Mammoth. He examined the kit under the wagon seat, checked each rawhide lashing, tested 2 ribs by bending them past their intended curve and watching them spring back. He looked at the oilskin packet with the dry clothes and opened it to check that the stockings were wool, not cotton. They were. Then he stood in the ravine with his hands at his sides and gave Beret the last rule. If you cannot see, he said. Let the mare choose down. Wind kills high. Steam hides low. Beret repeated it. Tolliff nodded once, picked up his tool bag, and walked south toward the Gardiner Road. He did not say goodbye. He did not say he would return. He said, listen before it speaks loud. And then he was gone over the ridge, and Beret was alone with a horse, a shelter kit, and a sky that had stopped pretending. The trip she should not have made began on a Thursday morning. Beret needed flour, lamp oil, salt, and the replacement stoveplate that Bell's yard man had held for her since October. Without the stoveplate, the cracked one would fail within weeks, and then the cabin's heat source would become an open fire on a dirt floor. Survivable, but dangerous, and a guarantee that every stick of wood would burn faster than a working stove consumed it. She could not wait for better weather because better weather was not coming. She could not leave the stoveplate for spring because the stove would not last until spring. She could not send someone because no one was offering. She hitched Marta to the light wagon at dawn. The air was still. The temperature was cold, but not killing. Perhaps 10 degrees above zero, though Beret had no thermometer. She loaded the shelter kit under the seat, checked the lashings, and drove the bench road toward Cinnabar with the sky sitting on the mountains like a lid. The morning was deceptive. Snow melted under Marta's hooves in patches where sun hit the ruts. A hawk circled. The sage looked brown and ordinary. Beret reached Cinnabar by mid-morning, loaded the flour, the oil, the salt, and the stove plate, and turned Marta back toward the claim. By early afternoon, the northwest sky closed. It did not darken, it erased. The line between mountain and cloud disappeared. The horizon went from a thing you could see to a thing you remembered. And then the wind came. It came from the northwest with a sound like canvas tearing, a ripping, horizontal violence that turned the air white in less time than it took Beret to pull her coat hood over her face. Snow did not fall. It flew. It moved sideways, then upward, then in spirals that had no direction at all. Visibility collapsed from miles to yards to nothing. Beret could not see Marta's ears. She could see the collar. She could see the gray of the mare's neck for perhaps 2 feet beyond the collar. Beyond that, the world was white noise. Not silent, not still, but a roaring, grinding whiteness that obliterated everything, including sound. The wind was so loud that Beret could not hear the wagon wheels on the road. She could not hear her own voice when she shouted. The temperature did not drop slowly. It fell the way a stone falls, fast, hard, and with total disregard for what stood underneath. Wet reins stiffened in Beret's hands. The lamp oil in the wagon bed turned sluggish, thickening toward a gel. Her eyelashes froze together. She pried them apart with her thumb and felt the lashes pull. Marta's nostrils crusted white within minutes. Beret tried the conventional response first. She pulled Marta's head left, toward Cinnabar, toward the town she had left 2 hours before. The mare resisted. Beret pulled harder. Marta planted her hooves and would not turn. Beret struck the mare's flank with the flat of her hand. Once. Marta did not move. And then, in the howling white center of a storm that had erased every landmark she knew, Beret heard Tolliff's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. If you cannot see, let the mare choose down. Wind kills high. Steam hides low. She dropped the reins. Marta turned, not toward Cinnabar, not toward the cabin. She turned south, off the road, into the broken benchland where the ravines cut through sage and stone toward the river. The mare moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the same instinct that had turned her head south every day in the lean-to, the smell of warmth in a world that was trying to kill them both. The wagon jolted off the road and onto raw ground. Rocks struck the wheels. The left rear axle screamed against a buried stump. Beret held the seat rail with both hands and felt the cold eating through her gloves, through the wool beneath, into the bones of her fingers. The wagon dropped into a ravine. Not the ravine, a different cut, steeper, choked with dead sage and snow. The wheels jammed against a rock shelf. Marta pulled. The traces went taut. The wagon did not move. Beret climbed down into wind that nearly took her off her feet. She stumbled to the front and saw the problem. The left wheel had wedged between two stones, and the rock shelf beneath the axle held the frame like a fist. The wagon was not moving again without a lever and time, and she had neither. She cut the traces with her belt knife. The leather was so stiff from cold that the blade skidded twice before it bit. Marta lunged forward, free of the wagon, and Beret grabbed the mare's collar and held on as the horse dragged her deeper into the ravine. Then the stoveplate, the thing she had come to Cinnabar to get, the reason she was on this road on this day, slid from the wagon bed as Beret yanked the shelter kit free. The iron plate fell edge first across her left hand. The pain was instant, bright, and wrong. She felt the skin split across her palm from the base of her thumb to the heel of her hand. Blood came fast, dark in the white air, hot against frozen skin, running down her wrist and into her sleeve. She had one usable hand, a panicked horse, a storm that had erased all direction, and a shelter kit lashed to a bundle she was dragging through snow with her right arm while her left hand bled into a glove she could not remove. If you are invested in this story, stay with it, because the next choice decides whether Beret saves the mare or loses the only reason she reached the ravine at all. Marta stopped. The mare planted her hooves and dropped her head and would not move forward or back. She stood in the bottom of the ravine with her ears flat and her breath making a cloud that the wind tore apart before it rose a foot. She was done running. She had found what she was looking for. Beret wiped blood from her eyes. She had touched her face without thinking and looked at what Marta had found. A snowbank, white like every other snowbank and every other ravine in the territory, except that this one was not entirely white. At its center, where the snow should have been deepest, a patch of dark stone showed through, ringed by mineral stain that glowed faintly green-gray even in the storm's flat light. The snow around the stone was thin, soft, melting from below, and rising from the crack in the basalt, visible only because the wind tore it sideways instead of letting it rise, was steam. Not the ravine Beret had practiced in, a different vent, a different crack, but the same signature: dark stone, yellow crust, bare ground in a field of white, and the earth breathing heat into an atmosphere that wanted everything dead. Beret dropped the bundle. She could not feel her left hand. She could feel the blood, wet and cooling in the glove, but the hand itself had gone numb. She had minutes, not hours. If she stopped moving, the blood loss and cold would finish what the storm had started. She cleared snow with the hatchet handle, swinging one-armed, dragging the blade in arcs that sent frozen crust flying. She stamped a circle, rough, maybe 8 feet instead of 10, because she could not see the edges. She pulled the willow ribs from the bundle with her teeth in her right hand and planted them in pairs, kicking the bases into frozen ground because she could not hold a stake and swing the hatchet simultaneously. The first rib pair fell. Wind caught the tops and bent them flat. She set them again, deeper, and lashed the crown with rope she held in her teeth while her right hand tied. The knot was ugly. It held. She draped the canvas. The wind caught it like a sail and ripped it from the ribs. The dome collapsed. Canvas and willows scattered into the white. Beret stood in the storm with blood running down her arm and a horse that had dropped to its knees, and she felt the cold inside her chest where the last of her certainty had been. The dome was gone. The theory was dead. She was going to die in this ravine, and Grieve was going to get the claim, and no one would remember that she had tried. Then Marta lifted her head. The mare was on her knees in the snow, ice matting her mane, her breath coming in huge clouds that the wind shredded. But she lifted her head and turned it toward Beret, and Beret saw the collar ring, the iron ring at the top of the harness collar where the traces had been attached before Beret cut them. She grabbed the canvas. She tied one edge to the collar ring with a rawhide loop that took her 4 attempts because her right hand was shaking and her teeth were bleeding where she had bitten the rope. She pulled Marta to her feet. The mare rose reluctantly, legs shaking, and positioned the horse on the upwind side of the vent. Marta's body became the windbreak. 1,600 pounds of draft horse standing between the storm and the shelter site, her broad flank cutting the wind enough that the canvas stopped flying and hung from the collar ring like a broken wing. Beret planted the ribs again. She staked the downwind edge. She set the crutch poles on the only stone she could find by kicking through snow, praying they were solid, knowing she had no time to tap them the way Tolef had taught her. She dragged the canvas over the frame and staked it with 3 of the 6 iron stakes. The others were lost in the snow, somewhere behind her, gone. The dome held, barely. It sagged on the left side where a rib had cracked. The canvas flapped at the base where the missing stakes should have been, but it held, and steam from the vent below flooded sideways under the pole baffle and filled the interior with wet, warm, sulfur-tasting air that made Beret gag before she remembered to open the slit. She pulled the drawstring. The slit opened. Steam vented upward. The gagging eased. She led Marta inside. The mare resisted. Celia had been right about horses and canvas, but the warmth was stronger than the fear. Marta ducked her head under the low frame and stood inside the dome with her legs braced and her body trembling and her head positioned by accident or instinct near the high slit where the air was cleanest. Beret stripped the ice from Marta's muzzle with her right hand. Her left hand had stopped bleeding. The cold had closed the wound the way cold closes everything, but the glove was soaked and the fingers beneath it would not answer when she told them to move. She dug the trench. 4 hatchet blows, one-handed, into frozen ground that fought back. The channel was shallow and crooked, but it sloped downward away from the dome, and when Beret held the candle stub at ankle height and lit it with a match she kept in the oilskin packet, the flame bent toward the trench and held. The bad air was leaving. Beret sat on the ground between Marta's front legs and pressed her back against the mare's chest. She could hear the horse's heart, fast, heavy, slowing. She could hear the storm outside, a sound like the world being dragged across gravel. She could hear the steam hissing against canvas, dripping down the steep walls into the drip channel, finding its way out through the slit. The inside of the dome was not comfortable. It was wet, loud, and it smelled of sulfur and horse sweat and blood. The temperature was above freezing, but not warm enough to stop shivering. Beret's clothes were soaked. Her left hand throbbed with a pain that meant the nerves were waking up, which meant the hand was not dead yet, which meant she would keep the fingers if she kept the blood moving. She pressed her face into Marta's mane. The mare's hair was damp and hot, and smelled like an animal that had been working hard enough to save something. Beret counted breaths. 50 for herself, 50 for the horse. She lost count and started again. The counting was not a plan. It was a way to stay awake because sleeping in this place, with the vent below and the gas pooling and the candle flame as the only warning, was something she would not come back from. Her head swam. She opened the slit wider, by pulling the drawstring another inch. Cold air bit her face. The sulfur smell faded. She closed the slit to a thumb's width and found the balance between warmth and poison that Tolef had described, but that only the body could learn. Outside, the blizzard peaked. The wind screamed against the canvas and found the gaps where stakes were missing and tried to peel the dome from the inside. Snow packed against the base and then, strangely, helped, banking the edges the way Beret would have banked them if she had time, sealing the worst gaps, turning the dome into a half-buried mound that the wind slid over instead of through. The hours passed. Beret did not sleep. She counted breaths, checked the candle, adjusted the slit, and spoke to Marta in Norwegian. Words that meant nothing and everything, the sounds her mother had used to calm animals in the barn in Bergen, the rhythm of a voice that refuses to stop because stopping means choosing to die. 3 miles north, on the open bench road where Beret should have been, a young hired hand named Jonas Rusk was trying to reach a hay camp for Greaves' yard. Rusk was 20, strong, experienced enough to ride in cold, but not experienced enough to know that this cold was different. His horse turned its back to the wind and stopped. Rusk dismounted to lead it. The wind knocked him sideways. He found a fence line and followed it, hand over hand, dragging the horse until his fingers could no longer grip the wire. They found Rusk the next morning, 2 miles from where he had started, curled against a fence post with his horse standing over him. The horse was alive. Rusk was alive. His right hand's fingers were blackened from the second knuckle to the tips. He would lose 3 of them before spring. He would keep the hand. Another team was found in a drift 1/2 mile from the hay camp. 2 horses, 1 wagon, both horses frozen standing. The driver had crawled under the wagon and survived by wrapping himself in grain sacks. He lost both ears and the feeling in his feet. The storm killed no one in the Cinnabar district that night, but it marked everyone who crossed it, and the marks were measured in fingers, ears, toes, and horses that would never work again. Dawn came the way dawn comes after a killing storm, slowly, reluctantly, as though the light had seen what the dark had done and was not sure it wanted responsibility. The wind dropped, the snow settled. The temperature held at something far below 0. Orrin Bell would later claim his porch thermometer read -32 that morning, and an unofficial reading near the Yellowstone Bridge allegedly showed -40, though the instrument's accuracy was never verified. Bell organized the search party. He rode out with 4 men, including a stage driver and a ranch hand who knew the bench road. Tolef was not there. He was at Mammoth, 20 miles south, and would not hear about the storm until the next day. But Bell knew the road Beret should have taken, and when they found the wagon wreckage in the ravine, stoveplate on the ground, cut traces, blood on the snow, Bell assumed the worst. They followed the ravine south, reading the snow for tracks that the storm had mostly buried. One man found a willow rod half buried in a drift. Another found an iron stake. Bell saw the dome first. From 30 yards, it looked like a snowbank that had developed a disease. The canvas was ice-skinned, sagging on one side, covered in a crust of frozen condensation that caught the early light in a way that stone and snow did not. A thin line of steam rose from the slit at the top, and the air above the dome shimmered faintly, the way air shimmers above a hot road in summer, except that it was 20 degrees below 0, and nothing in the landscape should have been warm enough to shimmer. Bell thought it was a grave. He dismounted and walked toward it with his hand on his coat front, where he kept a folding knife, as though whatever was inside might require a blade. Then Marta answered. The sound came from inside the dome, a low, thick whicker that was not quite a neigh, The sound a horse makes when it has been standing in one place for a very long time and hears a voice it recognizes. One of Bell's horses answered back. The ranch hand said something Bell did not hear. Bell pulled the canvas aside. Inside, in the dim, wet, sulfur-stinking warmth of a dome that should not have existed, Beret Stensland sat between the legs of a gray draft mare with her left hand wrapped in a bloody shirt and her right hand holding a candle stub that had burned down to a puddle of wax in a tin cup. Her face was white. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes were open and focused and utterly clear. "The trench needs clearing," she said. "The gas has been pooling for the last hour." Bell stood in the opening of the dome with cold air pouring past him and steam pouring past the cold air, and he did not speak for a long time. Then he stepped aside and let the daylight in and the bad air out, and Marta rose to her feet with the slow, stiff dignity of an animal that has survived something it will never understand. And Beret Stensland walked out of the earth's breath and into a morning that had already decided she was dead. She was not dead. She was burned, cut, soaked, exhausted, and 30 hours past the last time she had eaten. But she was not dead, and neither was the mare, and the dome behind her stood as evidence that the earth had offered something to a woman that no man, no store, no act of conventional wisdom would have given her. The question was no longer whether the method worked. The question was whether anyone would believe what it meant. Bell's men brought a blanket for Beret and a feed bag for Marta. They did not bring questions. The search party had expected to find a body, and finding a living woman sitting in a steam dome built with one hand during a killing blizzard was the kind of result that required silence before it required explanation. Beret rode Marta back to the cabin. The mare walked slowly, stiff from standing all night, but she walked. Bell sent a man ahead to start the stove. By the time Beret reached the cabin door, the cracked stoveplate was throwing enough heat to thaw the water bucket, and someone had stacked 3 armloads of cottonwood beside the door without being asked. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, her left hand was swollen twice its normal size, the cut crusted shut with dried blood and sulfur residue, and every joint in her body ached with the specific deep pain of muscles that had held one position for too long in cold that wanted them dead. Tollef arrived 3 days later. He had heard about the storm at Mammoth and walked the 20 miles to Beret's claim in a day and a half, carrying his tool bag and a tin of salve he had gotten from the Mammoth Hotel cook. He did not ask if Beret was alive. He had heard she was alive. He wanted to see the dome. Bell had left it standing. Whether out of respect, curiosity, or the simple fact that no one wanted to touch a structure that had done something they could not explain, the dome sat in the ravine exactly as Beret had built it, sagging, ice-skinned, with the canvas still tied to Marta's collar ring by a blood-stiff, rawhide knot. Tollef walked around it once. He crouched and examined the trench. He lifted the canvas edge and looked at the crutch poles. He tested the ground beneath each one by tapping with his mason's hammer, and when the sound came back solid on all 4, he closed his eyes for a moment and opened them again. He looked at the pole baffle. Steam still entered sideways, weaker now, but steady. The slit was open at the width Beret had left it. The drip channel along the interior edge was crusted with mineral deposit. The steam had been running long enough to leave its mark. Tollef touched the rawhide knot at the collar ring. The blood on it had turned black. The knot itself was ugly, a one-handed mess of loops and wraps that would have embarrassed any teamster. But it had held through 8 hours of wind that peeled roofing nails out of buildings in Cinnabar. "You remembered with one hand," Tollef said. He did not say it loudly. He did not say it with emotion that the moment did not earn. He said it the way a mason says a wall is plumb, as a statement of fact that carries the weight of every wall that was not. Beret stood at the edge of the ravine with her left hand wrapped in a clean bandage, and her right hand holding a tin cup of coffee that Tolliff had brewed on her stove. She did not answer. She did not need to. The dome answered. The knot answered. The candle stub, burned to a puddle in its tin cup, answered. Tolliff sat on his stone, the same stone where he had sat every morning during the building, and told Beret what she had done right and what she had done wrong. Right, the side baffle, the high slit, the trench, the steep canvas pitch that kept condensation running down the walls instead of dripping from the ceiling, the horse positioned with her head near the slit, the candle as a gas monitor, the counting of breaths as a way to stay awake. Wrong, the crutch poles set without tapping, on stones she could not verify, the trench too shallow. It had nearly silted shut overnight, and another hour of pooling gas would have overwhelmed the slit's ventilation. The missing stakes on the upwind side, compensated for by snowbanking but vulnerable to a wind shift. You were lucky 3 times, Tolliff said. The stones held. The trench lasted long enough. The wind did not shift. Next time, one of those will fail. Then I make the trench deeper and carry spare stakes, Beret said. Tolliff looked at her. His expression was not warm. It was something harder and more useful than warmth. The look of a man who recognized that the person standing in front of him did not need comfort. She needed correction, and she could take it. Yes, he said. Bell's admission came 4 days after the storm, on the porch of the stage yard in Cinnabar, where Beret had come to retrieve the stoveplate that the search party had recovered from the wrecked wagon. He was sitting on a barrel with his bad hip propped on a folded blanket, watching the road the way men who have managed stage routes watch roads, with the permanent suspicion that something is about to go wrong on them. Beret set the stoveplate in her wagon bed. Bell did not look at it. I told you a horse finds a barn, Bell said. I told you it does not find mercy. I remember. I was wrong. He shifted on the barrel. His hip made him wince, and the wince made him angry, and the anger made him honest. The horse did not find mercy. She found heat. That is a different thing. Heat does not care who you are. It is just there, doing what the earth does. You knew what to do with it. That is the part I missed. Beret held the stoveplate's edge and looked at Bell. His face had the specific redness of a man who has spent 30 years outside and will spend the next 10 pretending the damage does not matter. You missed it because no one showed you, Beret said. I missed it too, until someone showed me. Bell grunted. He did not ask who had shown her because he had seen Tolliff at the ravine, and he understood that some debts are not settled by naming them. I will tell the yard men, Bell said. If they are caught out, the ravine is a known shelter point. They should carry canvas. This was not a small thing. Bell ran the stage yard. What Bell told his drivers became practice, and practice became habit, and habit became the difference between a district that lost men to storms and a district that did not. His admission was not just personal, it was institutional. It changed the way the route was run. Beret nodded. She did not thank him. Thanking Bell for admitting he was wrong would have diminished both the admission and the person who forced it. She picked up the reins and drove back toward the claim with the stoveplate, and the knowledge that one wall of resistance had come down, not because she had argued it down, but because the storm had done the arguing for her. Celia came to the cabin on a Sunday. She brought her oldest boy, a 12-year-old named Paul, who had his mother's watchful eyes and his father's habit of standing at a distance until he understood what he was looking at. Show me where not to step, Celia said. She did not say she had been wrong. She did not say Beret had been right. She said, "Show me where not to step," which was the statement of a woman who had decided that knowledge was more useful than opinion, and that the person who had survived the storm was the person worth learning from. Beret took them to the ravine. She showed Celia the mineral crust, the yellow-gray patches that looked like dirt but sounded hollow when tapped with a stick. She showed Paul how to test ground by stepping on sage roots and exposed stone, never on flat ground near a vent. She showed them the safe approaches, the roots where basalt shelves and embedded boulders provided solid footing, and she marked 3 of them with strips of red cloth tied to willow stakes. Paul asked why the snow melted near the stone. Beret explained it the way Tolef had explained it to her. The earth holds heat the way a stove holds heat, and the heat finds cracks the way water finds cracks, and where it reaches the surface, the snow cannot stay. Celia knelt and held her hand over the vent. She felt the warmth. She pulled back and smelled the sulfur on her fingers. "I told you wet warmth kills," Celia said. "It does," Beret said. "If you seal the top and sleep on the ground, if you leave the vent open and sleep sitting up, it keeps you alive. The difference is 2 inches of slit and a trench." Celia looked at the dome, still standing, still breathing steam, still ugly. She looked at the red cloth markers on the safe approaches. She looked at her son, who was tapping the ground with a stick and listening to the difference between solid and hollow with the concentrated attention of a child learning something that matters. "Show Paul the candle test," Celia said. That was the moment the method stopped being Beret's secret and started becoming the community's knowledge. Not because Celia announced a conversion, but because she asked her son to learn it. A mother who teaches her child a survival method has decided it is real. There is no louder endorsement. The measurable comparison spread through the district in the weeks after the storm, carried by the same gossip network that had carried the mockery. Beret had used no cordwood overnight. 1 match, 1 candle stub, no fire, no fuel she had to cut, haul, or buy. The steam dome, once built, used the Earth's heat continuously, an energy source that required no labor beyond the initial construction and the constant vigilance of monitoring the gas. A normal, open fire in that storm, if one could have been maintained at all against the wind, would have required dry fuel that Beret did not have, and a wind shelter she could not have built with 1 hand. Bell calculated that a man with a fire on open ground in those conditions would have burned through a quarter cord of dry wood in a single night, assuming the wind did not scatter the coals. Beret had no dry wood. She had the earth. The comparison was not subtle. People understood it the way they understood any math that involved winter and survival. She lived because the method worked, and the method worked because it used what was already there instead of demanding what she did not have. Jonas Rusk, recovering in Cinnabar with 3 blackened fingers, heard about the dome from Bell's yard men. He said nothing publicly. But he sent a message to Beret through a stage driver, 2 words written on a scrap of brown paper. How long? He wanted to know how long it took to build. 22 minutes in practice. Longer in the storm, with 1 hand, with a horse, with the fear. Beret sent back her answer on the same scrap. Fast enough. Grieve did not convert. Grieve resisted with the specific tenacity of a man whose financial plan depended on Beret's failure, and who now watched that failure recede like a debt he could not collect. He called it luck. He told the store crowd that Beret had stumbled onto a warm spot and wrapped herself in canvas, and that any fool could survive a night if the ground happened to be heated. He said the search party had wasted time and horses on a woman who had no business on the bench road. He said the dome was a curiosity, not a method, and that recommending it to travelers was the same as recommending they jump off a cliff and hope for a ledge. His arguments were not entirely wrong. The dome was dangerous. The gas was real. The crust could break. Every element Grieve named was a genuine risk. But the difference between Grieve's logic and Bell's logic was that Bell had seen the dome, and Grieve had not. Bell had watched Beret walk out of a structure that should not have existed and heard her say, "The trench needs clearing." That sentence, calm, technical, specific, told Bell everything about whether the survival was luck or method. Grieve's power weakened because the mayor lived. The claim remained workable, and Bell now contradicted him publicly. When Grieve tried to call in Oddman's note at the store, Bell said, loudly enough for 3 witnesses to hear, "The note was signed under duress by a man who abandoned his wife. I would think carefully before waving it in front of a land office that might ask where Oddman went." Grieve put the note away. He did not tear it up. He was not yet ready for that. But he put it away, and the gesture told everyone watching that the paper's power had limits that had not existed before the storm. Tollef stayed through December. He and Beret built the first permanent cache at the ravine. Not a house, not a shelter, but an emergency station. A heavy wooden box, pegged shut against animals, containing a rolled canvas tarp, 12 willow hoops bundled with rawhide, 2 deadfall poles, a coil of rope, and a painted board nailed to a post. The board had 3 rules, written in Beret's block letters with lamp, black, and linseed oil. Do not stand on crust. Keep the vent open. Sleep high. Tollef carved the post from a cottonwood trunk, square on all 4 faces, sunk 3 feet into frozen ground. He set it in stone the way masons set foundations, with patience, with measurement, with the understanding that a thing built to last must be built slowly. They work together the way people work who share a language they did not learn in the same place. Tollef spoke Norwegian when English failed him, and Beret answered in the same tongue, and the words that passed between them carried the weight of a country they had both left and a knowledge they had both inherited, the specific, practical, woman-taught knowledge of stone and warmth and survival that the world did not write down because the world did not think it was worth writing. Tollef's backstory deepened through work, not confession. He told Beret about the spring box at Mammoth while they were sinking the post. He had been young and certain, the way young masons are certain that their hands know stone better than stone knows itself. He had stepped on crust that looked solid. It was not. The water was not boiling where he fell, but it was hot enough to cook the skin on his hand before he could pull free. The 2 fingers died over the next week, blackening, swelling, going quiet the way dying things go quiet. A doctor in Bozeman took them off with a saw and whiskey. "I learned 2 things," Tollef said, tapping the post level with his hammer. "First, the ground lies. It shows you a surface that has nothing to do with what is underneath. Second, the women who stored food in cellars understood heat transfer better than any mason I knew. They did not have the language for it. They had the practice." He looked at Beret. "You have the practice. You need to decide whether to keep it for yourself or give it away." "I have already decided," Beret said. "I know," Tollef said. "That is why I stayed." The disagreement came in the 3rd week of December, on a morning so cold that the coffee froze in the cup between the stove and the table. Tollef wanted the cache sealed with a lock. His argument was practical. Children, drunks, and fools would open the box, scatter the contents, damage the canvas, and leave the cache useless for the person who needed it. A lock kept the equipment intact. A key, held by Bell at the stage yard, ensured access for anyone who asked. Beret refused. Her argument was equally practical and entirely different. A person caught in a blizzard could not ride to Cinnabar and ask Bell for a key. The cache had to be open. If a child opened it and scattered the canvas could be restacked. If a drunk burned the willow hoops, the hoops could be replaced. But if a locked box stood between a freezing woman and the tools she needed to survive the night, the lock was a murderer. They argued. Tollef raised his voice, the first time Beret had heard him raise his voice, and said that open caches would be emptied by spring and the method would fail because the equipment would not be there when needed. Beret said, "Then I build 2 caches, and when one is emptied, I refill it." Tollef stared at her. "You cannot maintain every cache between here and Gardner." "I can maintain 3, and if 3 are not enough, I teach others to maintain them." Tollef sat on the stone outside the cabin and did not speak for a long time. The cold worked on them both. His missing fingers ached in weather like this, and Beret's cut hand throbbed under its bandage. "You are not building a shelter," Tollef said finally. "You are building a habit." "Yes," Beret said. He looked at the hammer in his hands. He looked at the ravine. He did not agree with her exactly, but he stopped arguing, which in Tollef was the same as conceding that the other person's reasoning had reached a place his could not follow. The cache stayed unlocked. In late January, Tollef's cough started. It was small at first, a catch in his throat after climbing, a rasp in his breath on cold mornings. He dismissed it the way men of 62 dismiss the body's complaints, by ignoring them until ignoring becomes impossible. By early February, the cough had a sound that Beret recognized from her mother's stories about the old men in Bergen who worked the stone quarries until the stone dust worked them back. Wet, deep, patient. A cough that had unpacked its bags and intended to stay. Tollef did not mention it. He came to the ravine. He helped Beret build a second cache a mile north of the first, along the bench road where the stage drivers passed. He taught her how to read the color of mineral crust, bright yellow for active vents, gray-white for cooling, dark brown for dead ground that had once been hot but was now safe. Each color was a map of the Earth's intentions, and reading it correctly was the difference between safe approach and fatal misstep. But the cough slowed him. He sat more often. He carried his tool bag with his right hand because lifting it with his left, the hand with the missing fingers, made him double over with a spasm that shook his whole frame. Beret did not ask him to leave. She did not tell him he was sick. She adjusted the pace of the work to match his body without saying so, the way strong people protect the dignity of people who are failing. She brewed coffee thicker. She split the cottonwood so he did not have to swing them all. She positioned the cache boxes so that the heavy lifting happened on the downhill side, where gravity did the work his lungs could not. Tollef noticed. He said nothing. The silence between them on the subject of his health was a form of respect that did not need language. Then February brought the secondary crisis, and Tollef was not there when it came. A stage sleigh carrying 2 tourists from the east, a driver named Hamrick, and Celia Dorr's youngest daughter, a 7-year-old named Karin who had developed a fever on the ride from Livingston, overturned on the bench road 3 miles from Beret's claim. The sleigh hit a drift, tilted, and threw the right runner into a drainage ditch. Hamrick broke 2 ribs against the brake handle. One tourist cracked his wrist. The other pulled Karin from the wreckage and wrapped her in a buffalo robe while Hamrick tried to right the sleigh with a broken body and failed. Bell was supposed to meet the sleigh at the midway point. He had ridden out from Cinnabar and was half a mile from the wreck when his buckskin stepped in a frozen rut and went down. Bell's bad hip took the fall. He could not remount. He sent the horse ahead with a slap and sat in the snow with a hip that had finally broken a piece it had been threatening to break for years. The horse reached the wreck. Hamrick recognized it as Bell's. He sent one of the tourists back along the road to find Bell, and the other tourist stayed with Karin, who was shivering under the buffalo robe with a fever that made her skin hot to the touch, even as the air froze the sweat on her forehead. Beret heard about the wreck from the tourist who came stumbling past her claim, shouting for help. She hitched Marta to the light wagon, the wagon she had repaired after the blizzard, with new traces and a reinforced axle, and loaded the shelter kit. She reached the wreck within the hour. What she found was a problem that had 3 parts and no simple answer. An injured driver who could not work, a child with a fever who could not stay in open cold, an overturned sleigh that could not be righted by one woman, and a storm building in the west, not a blizzard, not yet, but low cloud and falling temperature that promised a night no one should spend on the bench road. Beret assessed the thermal ground the way Tolef had taught her. The nearest warm seep was the ravine, her ravine, the one with the main vent and the first cache. But the main vent was strong, and when she held a candle near the ground at the ravine's bottom, the flame guttered and bent hard. The gas was pooling. The vent had surged, shifted, strengthened, done whatever vents do when the pressure below changes, and the air at ground level was no longer safe. A weaker person would have used the vent anyway. The heat was there. The cache was there. The canvas and the willow hoops were ready. But Beret remembered Tolef's stories. Eckert sealed in a warming shed, the horse with boiled legs, and she remembered the rule behind the rules. The safest heat is not the strongest heat. The safest heat is the heat you can control. She moved them 20 yards upslope to the smaller seep, the weaker one she had mapped during her first survey of the ravine, the one that barely warmed the air above it. She built a larger structure there, not a dome, a lean dome, half tent and half windbreak, using twice the canvas and longer poles to cover a space big enough for 5 people and a prone child. The weaker vent did not produce enough heat to warm the space fast. It took 40 minutes instead of 20 for the air to soften. But the candle flame held steady at every height, and the sulfur smell stayed faint, and the air inside the lean dome was breathable without the head-swimming nausea that the stronger vent would have caused. Hamrick sat against the wall, with his ribs bound in torn shirting. The 2 tourists pressed close to each other and said nothing useful. Karen lay on the buffalo robe with her head on Beret's folded coat, and Beret sat beside her and held a tin cup of water warmed by the vent, not hot, barely above tepid, but warm enough that a feverish child could drink it without shock. Karen drank. She drank half the cup, then slept. Her breathing was rough and fast, the breathing of a small body fighting something it could not name. But she was warm. She was not shivering. The fever was doing what fevers do, burning the sickness. And the lean dome was giving the fever a place to work that was not a frozen road. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the storm comes. Beret stayed awake through the night. She monitored the candle. She adjusted the slit. She cleared the trench twice when snow blocked the channel. She did everything Tolef had taught her, alone, without the mentor's voice beside her, and the absence of that voice was the loudest thing in the ravine. By morning, Karen's fever had broken enough that she could sit up and ask for food. Hamrick could walk with help. The tourists could carry gear. Bell, who had been found by his horse and dragged to the road by the returning tourist, arrived on a borrowed sleigh with 2 blankets and a face that said he had spent the night expecting to organize a recovery, not a rescue. He looked at the lean dome. He looked at the weaker vent Beret had chosen over the stronger one. He looked at the candle still burning steady at ankle height. "You did not use the main vent," he said. "The main vent failed the candle test," Beret said. Bell nodded slowly. This was not luck. This was not instinct. This was a woman who had rejected the obvious solution because she had learned that obvious solutions in thermal country could be lethal. The restraint, the willingness to choose weaker heat because weaker heat was controllable, was the part that separated a survivor from a practitioner. Celia arrived that afternoon. She had heard about the wreck from a neighbor and had walked 3 miles in frozen boots to reach the ravine. She found Karin sitting up in the lean dome, wrapped in the buffalo robe, eating broth that one of the tourists had made from dried beef and warm vent water. Celia knelt beside her daughter and held her, and did not speak for a long time. When she stood, she looked at Beret. "You chose the cold one," Celia said. She had seen the main vent. She had felt its heat when Beret first showed her the ravine. She understood what Beret had given up and why. "The cold one was safe," Beret said. "The hot one was not." Celia looked at the lean dome, at the longer poles, at the wider canvas, at the candle burning in its tin. She looked at her daughter, whose color was returning and whose eyes were focused, and whose small hands gripped the cup of broth with the fierce concentration of a child who is too young to understand what almost happened and old enough to know she was hungry. "Teach me to build this," Celia said. Tollef left in March, when the first thaw softened the road to Livingston. His cough had worsened through February, and by the time the snow began to melt, he walked with one hand pressed against his chest as though holding something together. He came to the cabin on his last morning carrying his tool bag in one hand and his stone mason's hammer in the other. The hammer was old, its handle worn smooth by 30 years of grip, its head chipped and reground until the original shape was a memory that only Tollef's hands remembered. He set the hammer on Beret's table. "You know the ground now," he said. "Listen before it speaks loud." Beret picked up the hammer. It was heavier than she expected. Dense iron head, ash handle, the kind of weight that belongs to a tool made for breaking stone and not for anything else. "I will bring it back when you return," she said. Tollef looked at her. His eyes were clear but tired, the tiredness of a body that has been generous with itself for 62 years and has begun to collect the debt. "Keep it near the door," he said. "A hammer is for work, not for waiting." He picked up his tool bag and walked south toward the Gardner Road. Beret stood in the doorway and watched until he crested the ridge and disappeared the way he had appeared, on safe ground, on solid stone, moving through thermal country with the knowledge of a man who had paid for every lesson with a piece of himself. She did not see him again. Word came in late May, carried by a freight driver who had passed through Helena. Tollef Asen had died in a boarding house near the smelter in his sleep, with his tool bag beside the bed and his boots on. The cough had become pneumonia, and the pneumonia had become the kind of quiet that does not recover. Beret took the hammer to the first cache and hung it on the post for one night. She stood in the ravine with the steam rising and the red cloth markers fluttering on the safe stone line and the painted rules facing the bench road, and she did not cry because crying was a luxury that used energy she needed for the work that Tollef had left her. In the morning, she took the hammer back. She hung it by the cabin door, where the light hit it first thing when she opened up for the day. Tools are for the living. Tollef had said that without saying it, in the way he had carried his bag every day of every year after losing the fingers, not as a memorial to what he had lost, but as a statement about what he could still do. Beret could still do this. She could build caches. She could teach ground reading. She could mark safe approaches and replace scattered canvas and refill emptied boxes. She could maintain the habit Tollef had recognized and she had named, and she could do it with 7 remaining fingers of her own. The cut on her left palm had healed, but the 2 smallest fingers on that hand never fully straightened again, scarred stiff by cold and sulfur, and the specific violence of surviving a night in a steam dome built one-handed in a killing storm. She and Tolef had the same number of working fingers now. She thought he would have found that worth a dry laugh and nothing more. Grieve, meanwhile, had not finished. In April, as the roads opened and the first travelers of the season passed through, Grieve began charging a toll for passage on the ravine trail. He claimed the trail crossed land tied to Odman's note, a stretch of legal fiction that relied on no one checking the actual survey markers, which showed the trail running along a territorial right-of-way that no private note could encumber. Beret found out when a freighter told her he had paid Grieve $2 to use the trail to the cache. The freighter was embarrassed. He had paid because Grieve had blocked the trail entrance with a hay wagon, and Grieve's boy Darrow had stood on the seat holding a shotgun he was probably not allowed to fire. Beret rode to Cinnabar the next morning. She found Bell at the stage yard, showed him the survey markers on a hand-drawn map she had copied from the land office files during a trip to Livingston in March, and asked him to witness a sworn statement. The statement was simple. The cache at the ravine was a public emergency station, not a private enterprise. The trail to it ran on territorial right-of-way. The equipment inside, canvas, willow hoops, poles, rope, had been provided by Beret Stensland at her own expense and was available to any traveler who needed it. No person had the legal right to charge for access to a public right-of-way. Bell signed. 2 stage drivers signed. Celia's husband, who had been watching quietly from the periphery of Beret's story for months and had finally decided which side he stood on, signed. Beret filed the statement with the Territorial Land Office. She sent a copy to Grieve by the same freight driver who had paid the toll, along with a note that said, in Beret's block letters, "The trail is public. The cache is free. Move the wagon." The wagon was gone by the next morning, Darrow and the shotgun with it. Grieve said nothing publicly, but 2 days later, he raised the price of hay at his store by 15 cents a bale. A petty tax on the community that everyone understood and no one could prove was connected. Grieve was cornered, but not converted. His note still existed. His claim to Beret's debt still stood. His legal leverage was cracking, but cracking was not breaking, and Grieve was the kind of man who could live in a crack position for years if spite provided enough mortar. The question was no longer whether Beret's method worked. The question was whether Grieve would face the method himself, whether the man who had mocked the ravine and the horse and the woman who listened to both would ever stand on the ground he had dismissed and discover what it felt like to need what he had laughed at. That question would wait for the next winter. But the next winter, in Yellowstone country, never waited long. Spring of 1887 came to the Yellowstone benchland the way it always came, not as a season, but as a negotiation. Snow melted and returned. Roads opened and closed. The temperature rose for 3 days and then dropped for 5, as though the winter had agreed to leave but kept walking back to check whether it had forgotten something. Beret used the thaw to build the third cache. She placed it 2 miles south of the claim, at a junction where the Gardner Road forked toward the river crossing. The thermal ground there was weaker, a single seep that barely warmed the soil above it, no vent strong enough to build a full dome over. But the seep was consistent, and the ground around it was solid basalt, and the spot was visible from the road. A traveler who knew to look for the painted post could find it in low visibility. 3 caches now marked the bench road between Cinnabar and the Gardner Fork. Each contained a rolled canvas, willow hoops, 2 poles, rope, and a candle in a tin. Each was mounted on a post with the 3 rules painted in Beret's block letters. Each was unlocked. The freighters noticed first. Stage drivers noticed second. By summer, at least 4 teams carried their own canvas hoops under wagon seats, not copies of Beret's design, but adaptations inspired by having seen the caches and asked Bell's yard men what they were for. "A hoop?" under a seat took up less room than a spare wheel spoke. It weighed nothing, and if the sky turned wrong on the bench road, a man with a canvas hoop and a knowledge of where the warm ground was had a chance that a man without both did not. Beret did not advertise. She maintained. She refilled the caches when they were opened. She replaced willow hoops that wind had cracked. She repainted the rules when weather faded the letters. And she taught, not in lectures, not in demonstrations staged for an audience, but in the specific, physical, one person at a time way that Tolef had taught her. She made Celia's boy Paul build a miniature dome over a kettle of boiling water set on the ground outside the cabin. The steam rose inside the canvas. Paul sealed the top. Within 2 minutes, the canvas sagged and hot drops fell on his hand. He jerked back. The welt was small and red, and it taught him what Beret's words could not. Close the slit, and the steam is nowhere to go but down, and down means onto you. What happens if a person is inside when the dripping starts? Beret asked. They get burned, Paul said, rubbing his hand. What happens if they cannot get out? Paul looked at the miniature dome with different eyes. The canvas was still dripping. The kettle underneath hissed. The air round it smelled like the ravine. They die, he said. The slit stays open, Beret said. Always. Paul nodded. He was 12. He would remember. She taught Belle's replacement driver, a young man from Bozeman named Arndt, who had never seen thermal ground before, how to tap a path with a willow rod. She walked him through the ravine slowly, stopping at each type of surface: safe stone, mineral crust, dead ground, active ground. She showed him the colors. She made him tap until he could hear the difference between solid and hollow with his eyes closed. She taught a rancher's wife from the gardener's side how to identify the sulfur smell before it became visible, although the faint egg rot that meant a vent was nearby, even when the ground showed no stain. The woman had nearly stepped through crust while gathering sage for medicine. She had felt the heat through her boot sole and jumped back. An inch deeper, and the water would have reached skin. Each person Beret taught added a layer to the method's survival, not because they repeated her design exactly, but because they carried the principle. The Earth's heat is available, but it is not safe until you make it safe, and making it safe requires specific knowledge that must be earned before it is needed. The teaching multiplied the consequences of any mistake. If Beret taught wrong, people would die trusting what she had told them. If she taught right but incomplete, people would die filling in the gaps with guesses. The weight of this responsibility showed in the care she took with every lesson. The way she made each student demonstrate before she confirmed, the way she tested them with wrong answers to see if they would correct her, the way she never said, "You understand," but instead asked, "Show me." Tolef had taught her this way. She passed it forward without naming it. The winter of 1887 to 88 was not as lethal as the one before it, but it was long and it was cold, and it tested every piece of infrastructure the district had built. Grieve spent the autumn raising hay prices and extending credit on terms that tightened like wire. He had not abandoned his claim to Beret's debt. The note still existed. Oddmund had still signed it, but the note's power depended on Beret defaulting, and Beret was not defaulting. She had enough hay, barely, because Belle arranged for his yard to sell her surplus at cost, a favor that was not charity, but was close enough that both of them pretended it was business. She had enough wood, barely dingum, because Celia's husband, who had finally decided that his wife's respect for Beret was worth more than Grieve's store credit, helped her cut 4 cords from a stand of dead lodgepole on his own claim. The cabin still leaked. The stove plate, replaced after the blizzard, held but consumed wood faster than a tight stove should. Marta was thin but sound. The claim was not prosperous by any measure, but it was occupied, improved, and legally defensible, and every month that Barrett remained on it moved her closer to the 5-year proof that would make the land hers without Odman's name on the title. Grieve watched from the store and waited. His opportunity came in late February, on a night that was not exceptional by Yellowstone standards, but was cold enough and sudden enough to catch a man who should have known better. Grieve had sent his hired man, not Darrow, who had quit after the shotgun incident, but a new man named Phipps, to retrieve hay from an outer storage shed 3 miles east of Cinnabar. The hay was Grieve's property, seized from a homesteader who had defaulted on a feed loan. Phipps was supposed to load the sleigh and return by dark. Phipps did not return by dark. Grieve waited 2 hours, then did what Grieve always did when his property was at risk. He went after it himself. He hitched his own sleigh horse, a tall bay that he kept better fed than any animal in the district, and drove east along the bench road toward the shed. The storm came from the north, not a blizzard, not the killing horizontal whiteness of the previous year, but a hard, fast snowfall driven by wind that dropped the temperature 20 degrees in an hour and turned the bench road into a suggestion. Grieve's bay balked at the wind. Grieve whipped the horse forward. The horse obeyed for a mile and then stopped and would not move. Grieve was not a fool. He was a merchant who had survived 20 Montana winters by staying inside when the weather turned and sending hired men to do what weather demanded. He had not dressed for exposure. He had not brought canvas or rope. He had not thought he needed to because the shed was 3 miles away and the storm was not supposed to arrive until morning. The bay bolted. The sleigh tipped. Grieve landed in a drift with one knee twisted under him and the reins trailing in the snow. The horse was gone, running north back toward its barn, following the instinct that Bell had once attributed to Mercy, and Beret had recognized as something simpler and more reliable. Grieve crawled. He crawled because his knee would not bear weight, and because the wind was too strong to stand against, and because the only thing he could see in the snowblind dark was the ground in front of his hands. He crawled for what felt like hours and was probably 30 minutes, and when his hands hit the base of a wooden post, he stopped. He could not read the words in the dark, but he could feel the post. Square, cottonwood, sunk deep, and he could feel the box at its base pegged shut, heavy. He pulled the peg and opened the lid and found by touch the things that Beret Stensland had put there: canvas, willow hoops, rope, poles, a candle in a tin. Grieve did not know how to build a dome, but he knew the rules. He had heard them mocked. He had mocked them himself. And they were written on the post above his head in block letters that he could not see but could remember, because Grieve had the kind of memory that retains what it despises. Do not stand on crust. Keep the vent open. Sleep high. He did not build a dome. He built a mess, canvas draped over willow hoops that collapsed twice before he wedged them against the post, rope knotted without pattern, the whole structure more blanket fort than shelter. But the vent beneath the post was active, and the steam entered the canvas, and the air inside warmed enough that Grieve stopped shivering. He opened the top. He remembered that much. The slit that Beret insisted on. The opening that everyone said was wasteful because it let heat escape. He opened it, and the sulfur smell thinned, and the headache that had been building behind his eyes eased. He did not open the trench. He was on his knees with a wrenched joint, and he could not dig, so the heavy gas pooled near the ground, and Grieve breathed it for an hour before the nausea started. He pulled himself higher, sitting upright, pressing his back against the post, and the nausea eased, and he understood in his body what Beret had understood in her mind. The bad air sinks. If you sleep low, you die. The third rule was not caution. It was arithmetic. Grieve survived the night. He did not sleep. He sat against the post with the canvas flapping and the steam hissing and the pain in his knee throbbing in time with his heartbeat, and he waited for morning the way men wait who have spent the night inside something they spent a year dismissing. Beret found him. She and Belle had ridden out at first light after Phipps stumbled into Cinnabar on foot with frostbitten ears and the news that Grieve had gone after him and not returned. They followed the bench road east and found the bay horse at a rancher's fence, lathered and trembling. They found the overturned sleigh a mile beyond. They found the cache. The canvas was half collapsed, crusted with ice. The willow hoops bent at angles that would have made Tolef wince. The post still stood. The painted rules faced the road. And inside, sitting against the post with his knee swollen to twice its size and his face the color of old tallow, Malin Grieve breathed the last of the night's air and looked at Beret with eyes that contained something she had never seen in them before. Not gratitude. Grieve was not built for gratitude. What she saw was the specific, unwilling honesty of a man who has been proven wrong by his own body in a place where his words could not follow him. "Your sign kept me from crawling where I would have died," Grieve said. His voice was hoarse. The sulfur had roughened his throat. "You did not open the trench," Beret said. "I could not dig." Beret crouched beside him. She looked at his knee. She looked at the canvas, the hoops, the half-open slit. He had kept the vent open. He had slept high. He had not stood on crust because he could not stand it all. 2 rules followed. 1 rule broken by circumstance, alive by the margin of what he had remembered from the woman he had mocked. Belle stood at the edge of the cache and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The scene said it. Grieve reached into his coat. His hands shook. Cold, exhaustion. The particular tremor of a man whose body has spent 8 hours running on fear and mineral-tainted air. He pulled out Oddman's note. The paper was creased, soft from being carried in the same pocket for 18 months. He held it out toward Beret. "Take it," he said. "Tear it up," Beret said. Grieve looked at the note. He looked at Beret. He looked at Belle, who was watching with the expression of a man who had spent 20 years on the frontier and had learned that the most important things happen in the smallest gestures. Grieve tore the note. 2 pieces, then 4, then 8. The pieces fell into the snow beside the cache. The wind took 2 of them. The rest settled into the wet ground and began to dissolve. Belle said, "If that note surfaces at the land office, I will file a fraud complaint and name you as the holder. Oddman signed under duress. You know it. I know it. Now the paper knows it." Grieve said nothing. He did not become warm. He did not become kind. He became honest enough to acknowledge, in the silence of a man who has torn up his own leverage, that the debt was never real, and the claim was never his, and the woman who had built the thing that saved him did not owe him anything. They loaded him onto the sleigh Belle had brought. His knee would take 3 months to heal. He would walk with a limp afterward, not as pronounced as Belle's, but persistent enough to remind him with every step of the night he had spent inside a structure he had called madness and found to be the only sane thing on the bench road. Niels Hogland arrived in the district in April, 2 weeks after the thaw opened the road from Livingston. He was 34, a widowed wagon carpenter whose wife had died of diphtheria 3 years before, leaving him with a trade, a set of tools, and the specific quietness of a man who has lost the person he talked to most and has not yet found another. He had come to Cinnabar because Belle had put out word that the stage yard needed a runner repaired, the same runner that had cracked during the sleigh wreck that brought on the secondary crisis. And Hoglan was the best carpenter between Livingston and the park boundary. Beret met him at Bell's yard. She had come to drop off a replacement candle supply for the middle cache and found Holland underneath the overturned sleigh, examining the cracked runner with the focused attention of a man who saw wood the way Tollef had seen stone, as a material with intentions that could be read. He was replacing the runner when he noticed the shelter kit lashed under Beret's wagon seat. He slid out from under the sleigh, wiped his hands on his trousers, and walked to the wagon without asking permission. "What is this?" he asked. "Emergency shelter," Beret said. Hoglan lifted the canvas bundle and weighed it in his hands. He examined the willow hoops, bending each one and watching it spring back. He looked at the rawhide lashings. He looked at the iron stakes. "The hoops are too rigid," he said. "If the wind loads them from the side, the joint will snap before the hoop flexes. You need a hinged joint, a lashing that allows rotation at the crown so the whole frame can give under load and return when the wind drops." Beret looked at him. No one had criticized the design on structural grounds since Tollef. The objections she received were philosophical. The method is dangerous. The method is foolish. The method is luck. Hoglan's objection was mechanical. He saw the frame the way a carpenter sees a frame, as a structure with stress points and failure modes. "Show me," Beret said. Hoglan built a prototype hinge from a strip of harness leather and 2 short pegs, sitting on Bell's yard fence with his knees as a workbench. The hinge allowed the crown joint to pivot 15 degrees in any direction. When he set 2 hoops in the hinge and pressed sideways, simulating wind load, the hoops tilted, absorbed the force, and returned to center when he released. "It will also trap condensation in the joint," Beret said. "Water collects at the crown. If the joint is leather, it rots within a season." Hogland looked at the hinge. He looked at Beret. His expression was not offended. It was interested. The expression of a craftsman who has been told his work has a flaw by someone who understands the conditions the work must survive. "Brass," he said. "A brass sleeve with a pin. Water runs off brass. Can you make one?" "I can make 6 before I leave for Livingston." He made 8. He came back 3 weeks later with a folding rib frame, the entire dome skeleton collapsible into a bundle the size of a bedroll, hinged at every joint with brass sleeves that Beret tested by leaving them in the ravine steam for a week. The brass held. The leather would have rotted in 3 days. Beret rejected the first version because the folding mechanism trapped condensation in the cross braces. The same problem she had identified at the hinge scaled to the full frame. Hoglan returned to Livingston. He came back in June with a second version. Cross braces angled downward so water ran off instead of pooling, and each brass sleeve drilled with a weep hole that let moisture escape. The second version worked. Their courtship happened inside the work and could not be separated from it. He improved the frame. She tested it. She identified failures. He engineered solutions. They spoke through the design the way musicians speak through a shared piece, not about the notes, but through them, each response building on what the other had offered. He respected her knowledge because it was specific, earned, and unarguable. She respected his skill because it solved problems she could identify but not fix. Neither of them confused the respect for something softer than it was. They were 2 people with compatible competences and compatible losses. His wife, her husband, both gone in different ways but leaving the same shape of absence. And the work filled the absence with something that was not a replacement but was enough. They married in the spring of 1889 in Livingston, with Bell and Celia as the witnesses. Beret had proven up enough improvements on the claim: the repaired cabin, the expanded lean-to, the fenced pasture, the 3 caches she maintained, that no one could argue she had married to keep the land. She had kept the land by keeping herself alive on it, and the marriage was a choice made from strength, not from need. Niels moved to the claim. He built a proper workshop beside the cabin, 16 by 20 feet, with a forge corner and a wood-bending station, and began producing folding rib frames for Bell's stage drivers and any freighter who ordered one. The frames were not expensive. They were not profit. They were the physical form of Beret's method, made portable by a carpenter who understood that a design only saves lives if it exists in enough hands to matter. The years after the marriage compressed the way years do when survival becomes routine and routine becomes life. Beret and Niels had 2 children, a boy in 1890 and a girl in 1892. The boy, named Tolef after the mason, had his mother's silence and his father's hands. The girl, named Christy, had a laugh that could be heard from the lean-to, which was now a proper barn with a shingled roof and a grain bin that Niels had built using the same stress point logic he applied to everything. They took in an orphaned niece, Celia's sister's child, for 3 winters when the sister died of fever, and the father could not manage alone. The niece slept in the loft and learned to read crust colors before she learned to read English, which Beret considered the correct order of priority. Marta bore a foal in the spring of 1888, sired by a Gardner rancher's draft stud, the fee paid in cash maintenance, and the foal grew into a thick-legged bay that Niels trained for wagon work. Marta herself aged the way good draft horses age, slowly, with dignity, losing speed before losing strength. She hauled lighter loads. She stood in the pasture and watched the bench land, with her ears forward, still turning south when the sulfur came. Marta died in 1899, old by draft horse standards, healthy until the last month, when her legs stiffened and she could not rise from the ground without help. Beret found her down in the pasture on an October morning, breathing evenly but unable to stand. Niels built a sling from canvas and poles, a design borrowed from the dome frames, scaled to 1,600 pounds, and they lifted Marta to her feet 3 times over 2 weeks. The 4th time, the mare did not try. They buried her near the cottonwood fence, not far from the lean-to where she had spent her first winter, turning her head south toward the smell that saved them both. Beret did not sell the hide. She did not mark the grave with a stone. She planted a cottonwood cutting beside it and let the tree do the remembering. Bell retired from the stage yard in 1895 with a hip that finally refused all negotiation. He moved to a room above the Cinnabar store, not Greaves' store. Grieve had sold out in 1893 to a man from Helena who did not know the history and did not care. Bell spent his remaining years sitting on a porch that faced the bench road, correcting anyone who called the ravine a miracle. It was not a miracle, Bell would say, to anyone who would listen and several who would not. It was a method. The woman built a method. Miracles do not have rules painted on posts. Grieve left the district in 1891. His knee never healed properly. His store credit business suffered after the note tearing because the story traveled Grieve had held a fraudulent note over a woman whose shelter saved his life. And the kind of people who relied on store credit were also the kind of people who kept track of who could be trusted. He sold the store, the hay operation, and the remaining notes to the Helena buyer and moved south to Billings, where no one knew his name or his limp or the night he had spent inside a thing he had called madness. He did not send word to Beret. She did not expect him to. By the early 1890s, Beret's operation had reached its full shape. The homestead, the workshop, Marta's foal, 3 marked emergency caches, and a winter route map that Bell's yard had copied and distributed to every stage driver and freighter working the Cinnabar Gardner corridor. The map showed thermal features, coded by color, the way Tolef had taught Beret was, with safe approaches marked in red and danger zones marked in black. The map was not beautiful, it was accurate. And accuracy on thermal ground was the difference between a tool and a death sentence. Beret taught newcomers the difference between a life-saving warm seep and a killing vent. She walked them through the ravine. She made them tap the ground. She made them hold the candle low and watch the flame. She made them build miniature domes over kettles and seal the tops and feel the drips and understand in their hands and on their skin what the rules on the painted post meant. Not everyone listened. A prospector in 1894 ignored the black markings on the map and tried to camp on a hot spring flat near the river crossing. He survived, but his mule did not, and the mule's screaming as it broke through the crust into water that Beret estimated at 160 degrees was a sound that carried to the claim a mile away and that Beret's son Tolef heard and never forgot. The community transformation was visible in small things. Canvas hoops under wagon seats, red cloth on willow stakes along the bench road, the phrase "check the candle" becoming shorthand for caution, used by drivers who had never seen a vent but who understood the principle. Test before you trust. And the phrase Beret had used in Grieve's store, the one that had seemed like stubbornness at the time, became something else in the years that followed. "I need time," she had said when Grieve pressed her to buy cordwood. Time was what the method bought, not heat, not shelter, not rescue. Time, the minutes between the storm and the dying, stretched just far enough by the earth's breath to let a person build something that the storm could not take away. Beret Stensland Hoagland lived out her later years on the same claim she had nearly lost. The cabin was expanded twice, once after Tolef was born, once after Christy Duu, and Niels's workshop became the largest building on the property, bigger than the house, because tools accumulated faster than children and took up more room. Tolef's hammer hung by the door until Beret died. She never used it for masonry. She used it for driving stakes, setting posts, and once, memorably, for cracking ice off the cash boxes after a late-season freeze that sealed the lids shut. The hammer was too heavy for the work and exactly right for the memory, and Beret carried both without complaint. She never called Marta clever. When people asked how the mayor had found the vent in the blizzard, Beret said the same thing every time. She was honest. She went where the warmth was. A clever animal would have gone where the barn was. In 1916, at the age of 59, Beret walked with a cane to the first cache after an autumn frost. The painted post was weathered but standing. The rules were faded but legible. The box held a canvas roll and two sets of folding brass-hinged hoops. Niels's design, which by then had been copied by 3 workshops in Livingston and was sold in the Gardner General Store for $2.75. Automobiles had begun replacing teams on the bench road. The ruts were wider. The sulfur smell was the same. Beret retied one faded red cloth marker on the safe stone line with fingers stiff from age and scarred from the night that had made everything else possible. The knot was not pretty. It held. By the early 1890s, at least 9 local families and stage workers knew Beret's 3 rules. Stay on stone, vent high and low, never sleep with your face near the ground. The method did not become a grand invention. It did not spread beyond the district in any organized way. It became what Tolef had named it, a habit, a canvas roll under a wagon seat, a rope line tied before the sky turned bad, a painted post at the edge of a ravine where the earth breathed and the snow did not stay. Beret lived her last years on the claim with Niels's folding frames stacked in the workshop shed and Tolef's hammer hanging by the door. Her children grew. Her son became a carpenter like his father. Her daughter married a school teacher and gardener and taught her own children the candle test before she taught them the alphabet. The orphaned niece went back to her father after 3 winters and took with her a set of willow hoops and a knowledge of crust colors that she would carry into a life Beret never saw but had prepared her for. Beret died in 1922 in the cabin in winter with the stove burning and the hammer on its nail and the light coming through the same window that had let in the cold on the night she first counted her wood and found it wanting. She was 65. The claim still stood. Snow moves over sage on the benchland north of Cinnabar. Sulfur breath lifts from a white bank where the earth has never stopped speaking. The painted post is weathered to gray, but the letters hold hum, block capitals in lampblack and linseed oil, written by a hand that learned its steadiness from a mason who lost 2 fingers and a mother who pressed her palm against cellar stone. A traveler sees the warning board and reads the old rule in Beret Stensland's block letters. The 3 lines that kept Malin Grieve alive on the night he crawled to the base of the post and discovered that the woman he had dismissed understood something the territory had refused to learn. A woman who takes counsel from a horse, Grieve had said, leaning on his counter with a note in his coat, has already lost the claim. The claim still stands. The horse lived to old age and was buried by the fence. The route changed because Beret trusted what the animal knew and then did the harder thing. She turned instinct into method, and method into habit, and habit into the kind of knowledge that outlasts the person who earned it. A faded strip of red cloth snaps on the safe stone line. Steam rises behind it from the crack in the dark basalt, curling upward into winter air, disappearing before anyone can tell where earth ends and weather begins.